All right, let's go. Let's get at it. Well, everybody, welcome everybody. Thank you for taking the time. We appreciate you joining us for this conversation today. Our topic today is amid geopolitical uncertainties and global recession, how can procurement keep its seat at the table? And now, usually at the end of the year, when Graham and I do webinars like this, we typically talk about, predictions and expectations for 2023 or for the coming year. We'll do a little bit of that, but we thought that this was a sort of a little bit of a broader, more timely topic to get into, just given everything that's been going on, right? And companies and corporations and individuals across the world, we've all been facing one of the toughest ever business landscapes that we've had. Continued inflation, soaring energy prices, increasing geopolitical tensions. I mean, not to understate that in any way. And now this threat of a looming recession. And of course, there's plenty of folks who are saying that we're already in a recession, whereas others are saying that there's going to be a significant one coming up. And in that context and in that environment, while procurement, I think one of the things we've talked about, whether it's in this webinar or any conference you go to, I mean, it's pretty clear. Procurement has been put under the spotlight during the pandemic. And by all accounts, it really raised its game, right? In helping deliver supply chain continuity and assurance and managing risk, et cetera, et cetera. But I think 2023 poses a altogether different challenge. So the question that we're going to focus on today in this conversation is really, how can the function keep its seat at the table to strategically support the C-suite, CEOs, CFOs, CFOs that we work for and work with, and enable value creation and overall organization success in this context of this ever-tightening economic environment, both at a macro and a micro level. So that's the overall context, if you will, the theme of what we're trying to do. And to discuss this topic, I'm really pleased to have a fantastic panel to have this conversation. I'm going to ask everybody to do their own introductions, but we have Damini Upadhyay, who is the Director of Procurement at Tata Steel UK. We have David Bondi, who has been a CPO at a number of great organizations and is starting a new role shortly, but I'll let everybody introduce themselves. And then, of course, the famous Graham Crawshaw, who is Procurement Content Director and Board Member at CASME. So if I could ask everybody to give a brief introduction of yourselves. Damini, perhaps you could go first.
Hi, hello everybody. Thanks Omer and Graham for organizing this session. I think it is the right time to organize this. So I'm Damini Upadhyay, as informed by Omer, Director Procurement Tata Steel UK. And I'm in this role for last 1.5 years. Before that, I was with Tata. I have been working with Tata Steel over last 32 years, and I have worked in various verticals of procurement, large capex, contracting, MRO, strategic sourcing, etc., the global IT buy, etc. And but I started my career in Tata Steel in the operations. In the first initial 10-12 years, I was in maintenance, and then I switched over to the commercial functions. Thank you.
All right, David, you go next.
Great, thank you, Omer. And to echo Demia's comment, Graham and Omer, thanks so much for the opportunity today. Appreciate being with everybody today. My name is David Bondi, Chief Procurement Officer for a company to be named in early January. Very excited about my new opportunity and looking forward to a new endeavor. Have been a Chief Procurement Officer most recently with Baxter Healthcare in Chicago. Prior to that with Revlon and Ralph Lauren in New York City. And then prior to that, spent a number of years at General Electric and Coca-Cola in Atlanta, Georgia. So looking forward to the topics of discussion today. I think we've all learned an awful lot the last couple of years related to what's happened in the environment. Procurement certainly has been under the spotlight, no doubt about it, when it comes to COVID and dealing with supply continuity. And we look at supply was a major issue in 2021. And then 22, we still have some supply issues. And now we're talking about a potential recession in some form or fashion. So we have to be nimble, we have to be agile and adjust accordingly. And looking forward to the conversation of how we continue to keep our seat at the table.
Fantastic, thanks, David. And now to the man who needs no introduction, but Graham, Please go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Omer. You always say that. Very embarrass me. So yeah, I'm from CASME, the membership community that supports indirect procurement professionals globally with interactive events and benchmarking. And I'm responsible for the content of CASME's 200 events supporting its 225 plus members. So delighted to be here today.
Very briefly, I'm Omer Abdullah, co-founder of the Smart Cube. I take care of our procurement business globally. We're an intelligence and analytics firm, for those who don't know us, based out of Chicago. All right, so let's, with introductions done, let's kind of dive into the core of our conversation. So, as I mentioned, the discussion today is really going to focus on what the procurement function needs to do to maintain its priority position and continue delivering on its promise. And we're going to tackle this topic in 4 parts over the course of this conversation. And the 4 questions that we're going to pose are, what are the key lessons that we've learned during 2022? So that's a bit of a retrospective view of what we take away from it. The second question will be, what does the upcoming risk of recession mean for procurement, and how will that change a bit of our philosophy? You know, there's an interesting idea.
Omer, can I cut in there? A number of people that we're all flagging up. Your sound quality is appalling, so I'm not sure quite what's going on there. So let me, just whilst you're sorting that out, I'm not quite sure what you need to do. Just repeat those questions, because I don't think anyone will have heard them, because they sounded as if you were in the well, I don't know, in some echoey hallway.
Oh, geez.
So
okay.
Sure
how's that? Is that any better?
Not really, to be perfectly honest. No.
Okay, let me see what I can do.
I'm sure you've probably got a plan B. Anyway, the questions, just whilst Omer, you may need to leave and just come back in. That might work. It's a really sophisticated IT solutions there. But yeah, what are the key lessons learnt during 2022? What does the upcoming recession mean for procurement? What are some of the strategic and tactical levers to stay ahead of the game? And then finally, how can the function continue to evolve in this environment, and what advice can we share going forward? So I think we should start with a poll. Omer, is your sound?
How's that? Is that any better?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, whatever you did, you've kicked the gremlins.
You know, I'm not even going to say what I did, because it's so embarrassing what I did. We'll just leave it off the table. But thank you, Graham, for picking it up. All right, so where are we? Are we at the first poll? Is that great?
I think we should. I'm just launching the first poll now, and that first poll is to ask you, what are the key lessons that you've learnt during 2022? And you can select just one that applies to you. So the options that we've got are great, and I can't read all of those.
I can read them.
So, yeah, I've got a greater understanding of the importance of strong stakeholder relationships, a greater understanding of the importance of supplier relationships, the need for agile supply chains, the need to change negotiation tactics and capabilities as a result of inflation, or the need to embed energy cost mitigation strategies. Now, you could only select one. I'm sure we'd all like to select all 4, but that's not possible. You got to select one. We really want you to think, what is the most important, the most significant that affects you and your organization? People are just responding, so just waiting for that poll to end. We've got over 100 and almost 170 people on the call, so I'll just wait till we've got a good percentage. So just select one of those, and we'll share the results, which I'm going to do now because we've got a good view. So there are the results. So 37% have said a greater understanding of the importance of strong supplier relationships. Omer, back to you.
Thanks. That's interesting. That's intriguing. And so, so that's clearly the front runner. The second thing is agile supply chains, need to change negotiating tactics, a stronger supply relationship. So, Damini and David, what's your take on that? You agree, disagree, thoughts?
Yeah, I'll give you my perspective. I think, look, no doubt any of those ones could be a viable candidate as far as being the front runner. But if you think about it, to me, what I learned over the last 2 years is really looking at the supplier relationships. Many suppliers we did business with, the reality of it is that they had the same issue that other competitors of theirs had, right? So who cares if you went to one supplier and said, I'm taking my business elsewhere, because the reality that other supplier had the same issues. So what I think I learned, probably the biggest lesson takeaway for me during the last 2 years or so, is around the supplier relationships and having the right relationship with those suppliers at the right level. And it was very eye-opening when you have discussions with suppliers and you don't know who the sales rep manager is, you don't know who the VP of sales, you don't know who the CEO of the company is. And I probably spoke to more CEOs in the last 2 years than I have in my entire life during the pandemic. And they weren't fun conversations, by the way. But
CEOs of suppliers specifically.
Yeah, CEOs of suppliers. Yeah. And dealing with those issues. So I think having those relationships becomes more paramount to me going forward, for the simple fact that you've got to have a good understanding of who the suppliers are, the structure of the organization, and having those relationships at the right level. Because the reality is, as we start looking at some of these inflationary things and we start looking at those things coming down, if there's supply continuity issues with that still exist in some form or fashion, they want to know who you are, and you need to know who they are to where you have that relationship. So that to me is paramount for sure.
So David, I'm going to come back to you in a second, but Damini, I'm going to ask you your take on that poll result. But I'll come back to you, David, in a second in terms of how you see how do you feel that's changed your perspective going forward, that the last couple of years of experience. But let me come back on that. Damini, does that align with your perspective in terms of the need for stronger supplier relationships?
Absolutely, Omer. So I'm in total agreement with the poll result. Is a very strong supplier relationship at the right levels across the organization goes a long way in tiding over the tough times. So this has been, as David mentioned, that over the last 3 years when we had the pandemic and then the geopolitical situations affected our supply chain, and at that point of time these relationships actually helped us in very critical tough times. Like, for example, during the pandemic, when there was a need for arranging PPEs at very short notice, even for the oxygen and the cylinders, etc. So this relationship with our suppliers actually helped us. They worked with us very closely to make sure that things are arranged. Not only that, there were lots of business changes which happened. And as David also mentioned, that suppliers also went through these changes. They were also constrained in similar ways as we were. But it helped because of the relationship, because of the alignment in our objectives and in our working together. This helped us in getting to the right place and in the end. So I'm very sure that the poll, everybody who has given this high score have experienced the same thing. I'm in total agreement with this.
Beyond supplier relationships, would there be any other areas that you look back in 22 and say, oh, you know what, this was a material learning for me or my team and how we operated and how we did business?
Yeah, so there are one or two things, Omer, like, for example, everybody talks about that we should always de-risk ourselves from the single source and everything. But during this geopolitical situation, the situation arising out of this war, etc., it actually exposed the vulnerability of our supply chain, of our over-dependency on one geography, which has really opened our eyes. It resulted in lots of issues in security of supply, not only from the availability of the material, but also in the transportation area. So this has really given us a food for our thought, that how do we bring enough resilience in our supply chain of mitigating this dependency on the single geography, so that today it is one geography, tomorrow it could be something else.
Yeah.
So this is one. And the second one, which I think has really given us a very good insight into, is how important the risk management is in our supply chain. So picking up the early warning indicators, which might be giving us the signals now that something can go wrong tomorrow, And if we are picking up on the right signals at the right time, then we have time to react in a better way. So that is the importance of a very robust risk management, not only at the first level of the supply chain, but tier 2, tier 3 supply chain as well, is something which we see as the change going forward in our processes.
Yeah, Graham, I'm going to come back to you in a second to get the CASME member view on all of this. But David, are there other areas in terms of how you think about it? And then how has this practically changed the way you and your teams have worked over the last 12 months or so?
Yeah, look, I think the dynamics are very different today of where they were 2 years ago. So, things have definitely changed. And you asked the question about, what should we do differently as an organization going forward as you look at this? And I think there's a couple of things to consider. So number one, the supplier relationships are critical, no doubt about that. Number two, having the right agreements with the suppliers and looking at supply continuity provisions within your agreements, I think becomes important. Looking at things like safety stock, looking at things like consignment inventory, there's many levers that can be pulled to ensure continuity of supply. So I think that becomes important. Yeah. And you talk about the supplier relationships. The question that I would ask the people on the call today is, you think about talking to your suppliers, how many of your suppliers say they want to go to you first when they have new innovation, or they have new technology, or they got new things to bring to the table? Are you the first customer that they think of? And if you're not, why is that? What can you do as an organization to have a better relationship with those suppliers? Because inevitably, when there is a supply issue, when there is a risk issue, they're going to take care of the important customers first. Yeah. And if you're not even on the radar, they even know who you are, and the leadership doesn't know who you are, then you're probably going to be at a greater risk than somebody else is. So think about that in the context of the relationship you have with the supplier, the agreements you have with the supplier. And I think the other thing that we've also learned over the last 2 years or so is really understanding who the suppliers are. And I can't tell you how many phone calls I've had with suppliers and where they're getting those products from. And I think the other thing we learned as well is really understanding the source of supply from the geopolitical perspective related to where this country of origin is coming for the raw materials. So all those things are factors. So I think in summary, it opened up our eyes to a lot of different things that we have been totally oblivious to historically, that we need to have the focus on going forward to understand how we can understand the suppliers better, to become more efficient in making the right decisions and looking at the supply base.
Graham, does that resonate with the CASME community? I know one of the things that you and I have talked a lot about for the last couple of years in particular has been, we always talk about supplier of choice, but this is an interesting idea. It's customer of choice, right? And you have to make sure that you are a customer of choice, because we've seen the practical implications of having that status, if you will. How does that resonate with kind of what you see within the CASME community and the member community there?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, totally agree on that. I mean, I think, first of all, we need to congratulate ourselves on doing a great job, something that procurement's not really very good at doing very often. But we've got through the pandemic. We've got plans to support or get around the Russia-Ukraine war. We've managed interest rates, utilities increases, inflation, supply chain disruption. The list goes on. And I think we've learned from every step. I mean, it does make you wonder what's next, but we've built on that. And that's also at a time when we talk about supply relationships, but we know many companies are actively trying to take advantage of high inflation to either boost or recover lost profits. So it's a big challenge that we've got out there, but we're doing a great job.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm mindful of time because I want to make sure we've got 3 more questions to consider and a couple of polls to do. I think the one thing, let me just add one thing, and then let's go to the looking ahead piece. Is I think just what each of you have said. If I look at the last year, it feels to me, if I take a step back, it's almost like we're in this. I don't want to overstate this, but like we're in this age of flexibility, if you will, right? Agility is the big buzzword that you'll hear at every single event and conference that we go to. But we are definitely in this age where if you look at what happened with Ukraine and supply sources there, everything that's going on in China, everything that's going on from an environmental perspective and climate and all of these other aspects, that agility seems to be more of a requirement than ever before. And that we need to be ready and thinking about all of these different alternatives while maintaining strong relationships there. But let's look ahead a little bit, and let's go to that second question. So with this idea of the recession, now whether, you know, again, as I said, some folks think we're here already. It's here, we're in the midst of it. Others say it's coming, and it's going to get a whole lot more severe in the next 12 months. But are there, if we look at that and we say, what does the upcoming risk of recession mean for procurement? Are there one or two key implications that you would focus on when it comes to these recessionary environments? And David, maybe if I can ask you to kick that off.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think there's a long list, but if you ask to keep it to one or two, I'll give you one external and then one internal. So from an external perspective, for me, it's really understanding the health and well-being of the supplier community. So I think so many times we think about the suppliers and we think they're fine, but we don't realize that they're a small company and they're at the brink of bankruptcy, or they're at the brink of cash flow challenge and they can't get product in. So if we start seeing this recession activity happening, I think it's extremely important, and Demay has talked about it earlier, is understand supply risk and really from a financial health perspective. So there's nothing preventing, I mean, there's many applications and tools that are out there today. I would absolutely recommend that people figure out how to go look at the health and well-being of their supply base. That to me is critical, even probably more so now that I think as we look at 23 embarkment. So that would be one from an external perspective. If we're looking about it from an internal perspective, I think that what companies can do and where procurement can earn a seat at the table is really looking at demand management and having the courage to challenge why you are buying goods and services. So who cares if I can go beat up an office supply company and get that $20 pen for $10? The question I would ask is, why am I buying a $10 pen? Right? So that's what the real question should be. So procurement has to have the right information and have the right knowledge and have the courage to challenge. And so looking at demand management levers within the organization. So again, I could go on for 25 more, but those to me, I think, are two key ones from an external and internal perspective.
Those are tough conversations, particularly on the demand management piece of it.
Absolutely. And look, I think, Omer, as you have those conversations, it's not procurement's role to tell the leadership, hey, we better stop buying these $20 pens, right? It's not our job to do that. What is our job is to share with the leadership the cost implications of buying that $20 pen. That's our job. So we can say, look, you're going to save 200 grand a year if you take out this pen line. I know it's a silly example, but you understand the point.
Sure.
But understanding what the implications are of making the decision and the buying activity of those particular products, that to me is the value proposition. We do not need to be in the business of trying to do, control what SKUs and so forth are done, but we should be in the business of understanding the implications of the decisions we make as an organization.
Yeah, I think that I hear you 100%. I mean, I think the pen example is a simple example, but if you extrapolate and scale it up to issues of complexity and over specification and multiple SKUs and all of these different aspects, I mean, it literally becomes a very material issue as you move into other areas, not only in indirect, but on the direct side as well. Damini, does that resonate? And are there other things that you think about in this regard?
Yeah, Omer. So in addition, to me, what looks like is that procurement will always be the one of the first functions to feel this impact of recessions or feel the pressure of the recession. And this certainly will mean that procurement has to work very closely and close collaboration with all the stakeholders, whether it is our colleagues in the other spectrum, that is on the other end of the spectrum, that is our marketing and sales, who are looking at how the demand is flattened. Demand is supposed to be flattened and come down in the during the recessionary area, and then the pressure comes on procurement to cut the costs. Yeah. So when, as David said, that cost cutting is something which is not only procurement's responsibility, but procurement can show the mirror to the operations. That this is what we are looking at, and this is how we want to make sure that without affecting the operations, this is how we can cut the cost. So these are few hard pointers which we will have to show to the operations, and then work closely with them. We will have to work, as procurement will have to work on first on the cost avoidance and then on the reductions, becoming leaner and meaner supply chain, with looking at the cutting out the flesh at every part of the supply chain, sub-process of the supply chain. So this is one thing. And second is that how to make sure that the supply chain doesn't dry up, because recession is going to hit our supplier partners as well. So during that, in that situation, whether how the suppliers are taking it, how they are getting affected, and where we might face a problem, that is the area where the procurement has to keep an eye on, work closely with the supplier partners to make sure that supply chain doesn't dry up. Yeah. That is these are the two things which I think will be very important. The implications.
So a couple of things that came up in that, I think, first off, on what both Damini, you said, and David said, I like the nuance on it, right? Because this is sort of an enduring complaint, if you will, that folks make about procurement is, well, procurement's always telling me what to do. And I think that's an important distinction and nuance. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you the implications of what you're doing. You decide if you think it's pivotal to the business that we have a $20 pen or whatever it might be. But let's make decisions with data, with insight that we need. And then we know what we're doing and why we're spending money the way we're spending. We're not questioning it later. I think that's a really interesting one. The second point, Damini, that you brought up that I think has been really huge in the last year and a half to 2 years, especially, is this idea of cost avoidance, right? So I think we're all familiar, and Graham, I'm going to come to you in just a second to hear what you've been hearing on this, but CFOs never wanted to hear about cost avoidance, right? That's not real. I don't want to deal with that. I feel like we're in an environment where we have to come to terms with what that means in a fair way, of course, and in a transparent way. But, Graham, I'd love to get your takes, and then Damini and David, please weigh in as well. But cost avoidance is real, and it has to be talked about. I mean, so, Graham, what's your take?
I've had more people talk to me about cost avoidance over the last 10, 12 weeks than the last 10 years, because it's impossible for many companies to actually get their savings targets, and therefore you've still got to demonstrate your value, and therefore accept that if you've got a legitimate cost avoidance and a calculation that's approved by finance, then that can really help you. The view essentially that a recession provides procurement with a great opportunity. So again, I'm very much a glass half full sort of approach to recession. You talk about demand management. You've only got to look in the area of utilities and energy, and suddenly projects that weren't viable previously now are viable. So I think it's to procurement to flag this up. We've all done the basics in terms of LED lights, but there is so much more that can be done. And to people that aren't involved with utilities contracts, you should still have some knowledge of what's going on in the marketplace, because it's likely to be impacting your suppliers. So you need to know to have those conversations, and fundamentally expecting that prices should come down as quickly as they needed to go up.
Yeah.
And if it did give you a challenge, then the cost avoidance shows that you're still delivering that value.
Yeah, it's interesting on the coming down, prices coming down. If you recall, Graham, in the last webinar we did a few months ago, I think one of the polls we did, there's a bunch of people who came back and said, well, we think this inflation issue is a temporary issue, and basically by the end of 23, it's going to go away, which is an interesting perspective. Let's not debate that right now, because I think we can spend a few hours debating that and have lots of views from the 200 or so people who were on this. But cost avoidance, Damini, David, how do either of you react to that and sort of think about that? Maybe Damini, let me tee you up first on that.
Yeah, so the Omer, for me, cost avoidance will certainly take a very center stage in the recessionary environment. Basically, when we say cost avoidance, it is better demand management, like what we must buy for the operations to continue, what we can have, but we can postpone it later for a later date when the time becomes better times come, and then what we can do without. So these are the kind of weighing we will have to continuously keep on doing in every item or service or whatever we are trying to buy. Evaluate with these glasses that, okay, if it is a must, then must go ahead. And then comes the question of how we can have a better contracting, the prices, how in recessionary environment, how the prices will come down. So that is a different part which procurement will have to take care of. But demand planning is very important when we talk about the cost avoidance. That is one point from me. Yeah.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And I think you're right. Let's be strict about what we're buying, and then let's tackle this issue of cost avoidance. David, your thoughts?
Yeah, so a couple of perspectives on the cost avoidance fund. Look, this is a fun, healthy discussion that every procurement organization has with their leadership. I've worked with leaders who've said, cost avoidance, who cares? That's your job. I mean, why are you even reporting that? You should be doing that every day. And then I've had other leaders say, look, it's a big deal, especially in an inflationary environment. If you have the ability to avoid an increase of 20% and you get it to 10, that's a win, right? Because procurement had to be involved. If they weren't involved, they would not have, show that 20% happened. So the reality of it is, I think it's a matter of how you tell the story, and avoidance has been a lot more prevalent now. And Graham, to your point, you've had a lot more conversations with them in the last couple of weeks than you have the last 10 years. And the reality is, it's because of the environment we're in from a macro perspective. So people look at these inflationary things that are happening, and procurement's now getting involved to figure out how they can kick that can down the road or prevent it from happening with the suppliers. So you have to do those things. Now, to me, the only way that procurement can be successful in this realm is having alignment with your finance organization. And I've always had the philosophy, never should procurement tell the business how much money they've saved. Finance should tell the business how much money procurement has saved. So having that third-party auditor, if you will, of sorts, be involved in every single transaction to be able to articulate the story, you got to go do that. Now, the other thing that people have said, well, I can't do that. I do that every single day. Well, I got it. So then there's this balance between having a good report and spending the time to tell the story and put it together, and other stuff that's just your day-to-day job. So you got to figure out what that balance is. But for me, having a third-party company or third-party entity, if you will, do the reporting on it, and the validation, I think, is paramount. We'll probably see some of that activity happening in 23, but with these recessionary activities potentially happening for us in 23, now is an opportunity for us to go back to the suppliers, because look, they came to us pretty quickly when stuff was going out. I'm not sure your phone's going to be ringing off the hook and saying, hey, you know what, crude went down and cheap steel went down, so we're now going to give you a 10% price reduction. So your phone is not going to be ringing from those guys. So you got to, be proactive and get ahead of that.
Yeah, better visibility, better insights into the data and what's happening in the market, as well as the quantitative information that you're getting. Look, yeah. I think it's so fascinating to me, right? This cost avoidance thing, and for those, we sort of grappled with the cost avoidance topic for so many years, but never in this same way, right? I mean, when's the last time we saw material inflation like we're talking about now? I mean, I think decades, literally decades. And I suspect there are probably a good number of the 200 people on this call who may not even have been born when we last really experienced it, right? So, but it's a fair topic, and it's coming up. On that note, I do want to get to the third question, but before the third question, by the way, is what are some of the strategic and tactical levers to stay ahead of the game? Before we do that, I believe we have poll number 2. Is that right, Greg?
We have, and I've just made that live. So again, please respond to this. And on this one, you can select 3 choices that apply. So what are your top 3 techniques to address inflation impact when negotiating contracts? So really trying to learn from me, what are you doing at the moment? So the list that we've got that you can choose from has come from benchmarking that we've already carried out. So we know all of these are pretty common and useful approaches. So extending contract terms, expanding the scope of work, negotiating discounts based on future volume, negotiating discounts by benchmarking supplier prices, negotiated defined maximum price increases, negotiating inflation sharing models, which is an interesting one, and negotiating added value services for the same investment. So we'll give you some time to work out the top 3 that you find most helpful in your organization as a way to mitigate some of the impacts? And as I said earlier, we know a lot of companies are trying to boost their profitability, boost their prices to gain greater levels of profit. So procurement's got a lot of work to do. So what are the 3 techniques to address the inflation impact that is most appropriate to your organization? The results are still coming in, so I'm stalling for time here because we really do want to get a feel. Thank you for everyone that's voting, and I'm just going to give it a few more seconds because we then want to get on to the conversation around this one. I'm going to end it there and share the results. Now, of course, the percentages don't work because you could apply 3 of these. So just look at the length of the bars on the chart. And I'm actually really quite amazed how the mix of the respondents, pushing the lead literally by not very much at all, is negotiating discounts by benchmarking supplier prices. My goodness, that's difficult. We could have a whole conversation around that, ensuring apples for apples comparison. I'm not going to go into any details on that, but that's a massive challenge, a really difficult one. Most of the others are pretty similar. Omer, what are your thoughts?
I'm just making a note of this. This is quite interesting to me. The negotiating discounts by benchmarking supplier prices, I mean, that makes sense. If I look at, you know, from a procurement insights and intelligence perspective and analytics, we get asked that question a lot in terms of what are other prices, how is the cost model made up, et cetera. Number 2 is negotiating defined maximum price increases. Kind of makes sense to me. But the other interesting one is the first one, which comes in at a close third, right? Which is extending contract terms as is, which is kind of interesting.
If you can, Omer. If you can,
absolutely. And I appreciate there's certain sectors of, in a whole bunch of sectors, including, frankly, Damini, yours, and David, the ones that you've most recently worked in, where that is going to be a challenge. What's Damini and David, what's your take on these choices? Surprised, not surprised?
Yeah, Omer, I'm not surprised actually, because for any given category, any one of these techniques will be taking the center stage. So more or less what the poll has come out, these are the techniques which are generally applied whenever there is a situation arises. But in this inflationary situation or the recessionary situation, the one which we are talking about is the negotiate based on the supplier's price. There, I think the strategy or would be on how we can have the should be cost model. That will help us in understanding what should be the price, and then there is a negotiation which takes place. So there all the inputs which are current, rising out of the current situation, the right inputs are coming in, and the supplier, and this can be worked with the suppliers so that it is an open book discussion. Yeah. This helps in getting at the optimum price. I will not talk about the reduced price or the higher price, optimum price. That is something which will foster the effectiveness of the contract going forward. It should not so happen that, okay, we with some tactics, we have got a price which is non-viable for our partners for a longer term. Then that contract tends to get into a different kind of trouble altogether. Yeah. So I think I'm not very surprised with this outcome. But given, like, for example, extending the contract term, especially in the services area, can we, for the same price, can we get something more out of the contract, out of the services?
Additional value.
Yeah, that creates the value. So where it has to be price, cost, value balancing has to be done. Yeah. We have to keep in mind that suppliers are also keen to have this contract running, because they will also need to have their business running. So we have to work together on this.
Yeah, I appreciate that nuance. You know, I get asked the question a lot, oh, is this price that I'm paying per unit the right price that I should be paying? And my answer to that is always, look, who knows? Because you can't compare it to X, even if that X company is smaller than you are, because they may be they may be buying a different specification that is more valuable to the supplier. They may be buying a different level of volume. They may be buying it in geographies that vary. There's a whole host of things that play into it. I think looking at it from a cost model point of view makes a lot of sense, because now you're looking from the bottom up and what makes up your cost, and then what's a fair margin for you to charge. Fair will vary, of course, by sector, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that's a good way to sort of look at it. I mean, David, does that resonate? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. You know, it's interesting. Yeah, so look, those many topics make sense as far as those questions and how they were responded. To me, I think one of the big things is to really truly understand what the market's doing. And knowledge is power to me, where suppliers may come to us and ask for a price increase, but really what's happening in the market. Understanding, I mean, you know, transportation is an example. People should have their pulse on what's happening in the transportation market for the cost of containers now than they were 6 months ago, where they were a year ago. And so I think having that detailed information of what's happening in the market becomes extremely important to have the right power and knowledge as you negotiate with your suppliers. So I think that's one critical thing that you've got to go do.
Yeah.
The other thing I'd say that is important as well is really looking at trying to qualify alternative suppliers. And how do you get your hands on creating competition? And if you don't have competition, then your leverage diminishes greatly. And I know in many cases, things are single source. It takes a long time to go qualify somebody else, et cetera. Got it. But where you have the opportunity to create competition, I think it's in your best interest to do so. So I think that makes a big difference as well. And the last thing I'd tell you is around, you know, I talked about having the courage to challenge, thinking about challenging the status quo. And the question I would ask of the panel, I mean, of the people on the call, is how many of you sit down with a supplier and saying, hey, Mr. Supplier, what can my company do differently to lower the cost of the goods from your organization? What can I do differently? And in many cases, the suppliers freak out, like, well, what do you mean? So if you have the opportunity to sit down with the supplier and saying, hey, this is my cost that I'm paying with the organization today, what are levers that I can pull to reduce the total cost of ownership, whether it's transportation, whether it's minimum order quantities, economic order quantities, lead time, safety stock. I mean, there's multiple levers that you can go pull. What can I do differently? And they may come up with a crazy idea that there's no way you can agree to, and that's okay. But they may come up with some pretty cool ideas that we didn't know that we were doing a practice that was causing us to pay more. But we sometimes just don't have the relationship, or we don't feel comfortable asking the supplier those questions. So
I agree. I think there's tremendous value. I'll give a little quick anecdote, not to date myself, but you know, in my early days in procurement and consulting, we were looking at payroll services, and this is back in like the 90s, and we looked at the costs and we were like, well, these costs look ridiculous. They look really high, and we went back and we spoke to the vendor, the third-party outsourced vendor, and the vendor came back and said, oh yeah, you want to know why? Well, here's your cost. Literally, I can't remember the numbers, but ballpark, it was like 55–60% of the cost is because you have us do manual workarounds and activity that adds to the complexity.
Yeah.
Because you think, you know, things are so unique, but let me tell you, they're not. And if we did this, and this, it'll take it down. We'll reduce our prices because we will make a profit, and it's fair, right? We make a profit and go from there. So you're right. I think ask the question. You never, I don't want to say you never know what you learn, but you'll get some real insights coming out of that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times suppliers will be relieved that you asked the question, and they'll be telling you all the stuff. They're like, whoa, that's really happening, and you have no idea. But you've now given the platform in order for them to educate you and tell you how you're running your business with them.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Omer, so actually this is a very important aspect of having a very strong supplier relationship. So in this supplier relationship, one aspect is how we can create value together in the whole supply chain between the supplier and us, and then share that value. So this, whatever we are looking at, if this is the price we are paying for a particular commodity or the service, how we can bring down that price by looking at the processes, at looking at the supply chain end to end, from suppliers to till the end of the supply chain at customers end, and where we can tweak something which will generate value and then share that value with the suppliers. And this particular approach gives lots of value. We have experienced this with many of our supplier relationship programs with our strategic suppliers.
Yeah.
And it helps both the organization, because it is creating value for both. So it is something which they take it very positively.
Yeah, I think that idea of incentives is an interesting one. Graham, how does that play in? Are you hearing those conversations in terms of having the conversation with suppliers and how you look at tactically dealing with this?
I am, but I must admit, I think I also need to share that quite a number of companies are saying there's going to be a focus on working capital, which is a bit of a quick and dirty, put pressure on the supplier, extend payment terms, not pay them. And I've had conversations where companies are looking to really extend, push out further. And that's not really helpful. So I think what we've heard from David and Damini is much more professional, much more long-term, sort of working together type solutions. And you need to try and avoid the quick and dirty note from finance that says just we're going to pay 90 days rather than 60 or even longer. And we've heard some horrific payment terms being discussed quite recently. So you've got to sort of almost take control so that you can do some of the good things we've just heard, rather than be under pressure from finance to get a quick fix.
Yeah, 100%. And it goes back to that customer of choice conversation that we were having a few minutes ago, right? And how that plays in. I mean, we're not going to get into it, but I've heard stories that go well beyond 90. I've heard 150 days. I've heard 150 days, and I'm not going to process your invoice until 30 days after I receive it, which essentially makes it 6 months before the supplier gets paid. And for any supplier, that's a tough ask. But again, let's not get into that in this conversation.
365 is the longest I heard, and it was in the press in the UK, an advertising agency last week. So you can check that one out. They've been slated for doing it, but it's not what procurement should be doing. Some of the good things that are working together, take cost out. That's really what we should be all about.
Yep, 100%. I'm mindful, we have this problem every single time. We have literally 11 minutes left. Let's quickly do the next poll. I think we have one final poll and then the question, one remaining question to talk about.
So this poll, you can answer 2 of the options. So what can the function do to evolve and keep its seat at the table? So we want to learn from you. What are you doing to really demonstrate the value and how procurement can remain connected, as we've been talking about? 5 options for you. More closely aligned with strategic corporate priorities and objectives. Partner more closely with the CFO to identify and respond to inflationary and supply chain pressures. Double down on the already developed procurement transformational plan. Increase and/or speed up technology investments to really drive digitalization, and invest more deeply in talent. I bet you'd all like to tick them all. We're not letting you. Only select 2 of those, because we really want to see what is the direction that procurement is going in to keep its seat at the table in 2023. Just giving you a few more seconds, and then we'll get some input on that one. So a few more. Yeah, people are still responding. And just to share with you, the top 3 issues around inflation, as reported by CASME members in November: shortage, rising cost of labor, increased production costs, and still the issue around energy prices and the impact that they're having. So just a soundbite. Whilst I captured all the results, I'm going to end the poll there in the interest of time and share the results. Again, you can't rely on the percentages. Look at the length of the bar. I'm not surprised. We keep talking about this. Get aligned with strategic corporate objectives. That's how you're going to keep your seat at the table, and the others follow suit. Back to you, Omer.
That's interesting. So align with corporate strategic priorities, partner more closely with the CFO. Makes a lot of sense to me. David, does that resonate? And are there other sort of advice you would give to a procurement leader as they head into this environment?
Yeah, so hands down, absolutely alignment with the corporate priorities, right? So procurement can have their own strategic initiatives and priorities. If they don't align with the business, they mean nothing. So it's absolutely imperative that there is things that procurement is focusing on is what matters most to the business. It's a no-brainer, very basic thing. And I don't know why anything else would be more important. So I feel pretty strongly about that. Having alignment from the organization, I think, becomes important. The other thing, so got it, alignment with the CFO. And look, I think we've had more discussions with CFOs than we'd like to have around inflationary things that are happening, supply continuity, et cetera. So all those things, so that it doesn't surprise me. The one that I'm surprised that's a little bit low is around the technology investment. You know, we heard about digital transformations, and that was a big buzzword if you think about, you know, a year and a half ago, and everyone was going digital and everyone's doing all these transformations around technology. I think even more so now as an organization grows, how do you become more efficient with your technology, and how do you exploit the data? So I'm a big fan of taking data, turning it into information, and then making it actionable. And unless you've got really good data and good systems, many of these things you can't go do, and you can't do them timely and efficiently. And you talked about agility or the need to change promptly within procurement organizations. Well, you got to have the right information to be able to make those decisions timely. And if you've got spend data that's suddenly 6 months old, you know, you can't respond quickly enough to go make their appropriate changes. So having that information quickly, timely, accurate is extremely important. So that to me is one that I would say should continue to be a focus for procurement organizations. As we look at this recession activity, potentially, you look at demand management opportunities, you look at specification changes, you look at spend by supplier, there's so many value propositions that can be derived of having the right technology deployed in the procurement organization.
Yeah. Makes sense. I want to touch on that point in a second, but Damini, your thoughts, your takeaway on this.
Absolutely right. You have to be, the procurement has to be in complete alignment with the corporate strategy, and of course we'll have to work very closely with the CFO. These 2 points are absolutely the most important thing. And of course, one thing for me is that how fast you can do the analytics, how fast you can churn the data to see, to give a right picture to the CFO and to the organization where we are progressing, and so that we have enough time and visibility where we have to go for the mid-course corrections. So to me, the analytics also takes a very important aspect. It takes a very important position in the whole. When we are looking at the aligning to the corporate strategy, then analytics of where we are going, how we are going, what the market is, how the market is moving, and how it is impacting us. So what is the changes we have to bring in our processes, in our approach, in our strategy at the tactical level. These are the things which will have to continuously be worked upon, and it cannot be a static or a quarterly or a half-yearly exercise anymore. So agility, to bring agility, as David said, that technology is very important. How fast we can get the right data, how fast we can churn the right data, get the right MIS, and take the right decisions. So these are the important points for me. Yeah.
So if I summarize what you just said, and Graham, how does this play with the CASME community? So if I summarize, we're talking about agility, we're talking about continued investment in technology to drive visibility. So you have more information, more insight, more data, alignment with corporate priorities, and then everything that you do should cascade down from that. How does that play out with what the CASME community has been talking about these last 6 to 12 months?
I think absolutely does resonate very, very closely. The chat's going wild because people are saying, what about talent? I mean, it's all vital. There are so many balls
how do you choose?
Juggling, because the talent's important, the risk management, the ESG. Where do you stop? You've got to be doing all of these activities, and I wonder we're all crazy busy. But yeah, that's also goes into the mix. You can't just focus on one area. I think it's a blend of all these activities that are so important to get right and support for 23.
Yeah, and to the folks on the on the webinar, you know, we are being a little unfair with these poll questions because we only give you a couple of options to choose from. When I know we all want to choose them all. We'd rather rank order them. But, you know, I think that pushes the conversation, that pushes the debate as to where it's going. I don't think we're going to have time for questions, but I want to tee up one idea, and it's more of a question as to where 23 is going to go. So procurement, again, I'm going to use some cliches, right? Procurement earned its seat at the table, delivered a lot of value, done a lot of good things in the pandemic. Now we're moving into a recessionary environment where CFOs typically, and I don't want to put this as a broad brush, but CFOs typically look at cost cutting. They look at measurement of budgets. They look at, okay, what can I get rid of from an excess perspective? We've kind of earned the right to spend a bit more and get things done because that extra dollar typically delivers 10x, 20x, whatever is on the value scale in terms of a return. I think the one question I just pose is, what do you think that mentality is going to be in this recessionary environment? Of course, it probably depends on the extent of the recession, but let me just leave that. We have like 2 minutes, but if we can get thoughts from folks. Damini, maybe starting with you, you know, will that CFO mindset change? Will it remain? How do we stay ahead of it?
Omer, I don't think CFO's mindset will remain the same. While that $1 spend gives a 10x in future, but in the recessionary environment, that 10x is coming down. So CFO will certainly be looking at how that $1 it has to be brought down so that your cost of operations doesn't go haywire. So CFO's mindset will certainly be changing. That is something inevitable.
David,
but
your thoughts?
If you look at it same way, but if you look at it from the operations perspective, people will still be looking at, okay, if I'm able to spend this, I'm able to get that extra production, I'm able to have that opportunity of selling it in the market. So at what level of organization, at what supply chain you are, there will be a different mindset, but overall alignment will from the CFOs will be there, that there has to be a cost cutting. There's no doubt about it.
Strong focus on value. David, your thoughts?
Yeah, so you talk about you know, procurement having a seat at the table. Somebody told me the other day, which I thought was really good, that they said procurement doesn't own a seat at the table. They rent a seat at the table, and rent is due every day. So I thought there's a pretty good expression as far as how procurement sits at the table. And I think procurement will still be very much involved with the finance leadership going forward. I go back to my comment about the digital requirement that we have within procurement, because I think what's going to be important as 23 comes around is having that information to be able to share with the leadership in a timely manner, decisions that can be made and levers that can be pulled to help reduce the cost for the organization. And that cannot be done without the right information. So to me, what's going to be important as we look at 23, having the right reporting systems in place to have visibility to those cost structures and understand what levers can be pulled to make the appropriate adjustments. And if procurement can have that information working very closely with the IT organization and have that information available timely and quickly and accurately with the leadership, I think that that rent gets paid every day sitting at the leadership's table.
Yeah, don't take it for granted. Keep earning your place there, and you do that through more visibility, more insight, intense focus on value, and driving benefits to the entire corporation.
Exactly.
I think that's fantastic. Well, my apologies to the folks on the call. We cannot get to questions. We will look at your questions, we promise. And then, you know, depending on the questions, the nature of them, et cetera, we'll come out with a response separately. But in closing, we're right over time, but I would just want to thank everybody. Damini, David, Graham, thanks so much for being part of this year-end closing webinar. And thanks to the 200 or so folks who took the time out to listen to this conversation, and thanks for participating. Everybody have a great end of year.